Good afternoon. I'm Nigel Lloyd, and I've been working on a project called Applebud, which some of you may have got bored of hearing about by now, but it's a project for the Polish construction industry, setting up an APL system. And the word BUD in Polish is the root word for construction. So Applebud is very nice, and you're all meant to admire the artistry of the apple bud in the corner of the logo. I'd have worn one behind my ear, but it's the wrong season for that sort of thing here. And what I want to do is to actually talk about three things. One is what's happening in Europe related to RPL, and also about the Applebud project itself. I'm frightened that I've got a hideously large number of overheads, so I shall probably gabble my way through, and I apologize for that. But what I suggest is that we'll stop at half-time when I should have traversed the whole of Europe, and we can have questions then. I'm just worried that if you stop me in mid-flow, then I'll never get to the end, and Applebud will be terribly upset. Is that all right? Permission to leave now granted. Okay. Are you really leaving now?
I'll be back.
Okay. In Europe, some of you may have come across the name of Jens Bjornevold. He's been the person, probably more than any other, who has pushed the recognition of prior learning, the accreditation of prior learning. And in the Applebud conference about a month ago, he said this, and I thought it's worth repeating right at the beginning. In the majority of the EU member states, validation, and that of course is the European word for recognition of prior learning, validation is an explicit part of lifelong learning policies, an important part of reforms of qualification systems and frameworks, an issue of relevance to human resource management in enterprises and sectors. Validation has been introduced into the legal and institutional frameworks of most countries. The actual number of individuals using validation is still relatively low. And that's a pretty good summary, I think, of where we are. It's very exciting in Europe because a lot of things are happening, a lot of new developments, and a lot of good developments are happening. But I wouldn't want you to come away with a false impression that we are already in promised land in Europe, because it's very much work in progress and things developing. Reality always tends to lag behind ideals and policies, and that is also true. Europe has more or less adopted English as its lingua franca now, but in order to make the English feel not so much at home, and the Scots, then we have special Eurospeak. And so I thought I'd let you see some of the words, and I'll try to express what they mean during the course of this presentation. And in particular, you'll have a tourist view of most of the capitals of Europe as we go through. So start off with, we'll be talking about the Bologna process and the Copenhagen process, about Europass, etc., etc. You can read those. And validation of informal and non-formal learning, that is very much the standard Eurospeak, though I think it may be changing, for recognition of prior learning. And then, of course, we have, even in English, innumerable sets of initials which mean, as near as damn it, the same thing. And I want to tell you about Applebud and very briefly about Unilo, which is another project. So, starting off with our tour of the capitals of Europe, the Lisbon objectives, which is a sort of overarching voluntary plan for how the European Union is going to develop. And they had a set of objectives which were basically that we were going to move Europe towards the knowledge society. and then they've tried to work out in increasing detail a set of frameworks and processes to move Europe in that direction. One of those processes is the Bologna process, and that's for universities, higher education. And it's a framework for EHEA, started just over 10 years ago, and you'll remember, I'm sure, that the European Union has 28 countries in, and there's, I think, 3 which are applicant countries at the moment. You'll notice that this is for 46 countries. And I think it's very significant that in all of this, we're not just talking about the European Union, we're not just talking about countries that want to join the European Union, we're talking about Europe. So that this is voluntarily a lot of other countries joining. And so in the Bologna process, you have as well Russia, you have, I think, most of the CIS, which is the old USSR countries taking part. You've got 1 or 2 that are more decoration than anything else. Liechtenstein is a member, and the Vatican City is a member. They boost the numbers, but they perhaps don't make all that much difference. I hope this isn't being televised across the world. The intention of the Bologna process is that we should have a single market for higher education across Europe. And what that means is that when you finish one degree, you should be able to go on and do another degree in a different country. And of course, that doesn't work if one country has a first degree that's 3 years long, and the next country has a first degree that's 6 years long, which is what the situation was in Europe up to 1999. And more than that, the countries that had 6-year ones, those universities had been doing it for 1,000 years. So that's the sort of context we're talking about. One of the things that you also have in Europe is that, and I think it's different from Canada and from the UK and a few countries, the professional title tends to come from the university degree. When you've got your university degree, then you are an engineer, or you are a doctor, or you are a lawyer. Whereas in the Commonwealth countries, it tends to be that you need to, after you've got your degree, have to then be a member of a professional institution, and after they've seen you practice for a couple of years, they will then review whether you are competent in the workplace, and then you get your title. So that's one of the differences which still hasn't properly been resolved. One of the things then that Bologna processes also majored on is that learning outcomes are important, and that the outcomes of learning are learning outcomes. All university courses must be expressed in terms of learning outcomes. Again, this is revolutionary stuff. We've had a long period of curriculum where you decide what you're going to pass in front of people, but here we're talking about learning outcomes, and that has been agreed across Europe. Still not implemented everywhere, and still not implemented very well everywhere. And the reason I've written less than or equal to competencies is because, of course, you can easily have a learning outcome from a course, or all the learning outcomes from a course, which are, for example, knowledge, but which are not full competence. If you have a learning outcome which is full competence, which you tend to have, for example, with a professional institution qualification, then yes, it covers the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, the competence in the workplace. But you can have learning outcomes which are not full competence. So I wanted to say that learning outcomes can be the same as competencies, or in fact occupational standards, but they don't need to be. They can be less than. And another of the things that the Bologna process has agreed and moved on is modularizing things. If you have learning outcomes, then it is very much looking at what makes up the overall learning outcomes, the overall competence that you want to achieve, And so modularization, being able to deliver part of it as a package, is very much a part of it. And there is, therefore, a big tendency towards modularization. I've got quite good at saying that fast. It's not easy when you start. Second process, Copenhagen process, is for vocational education and training. And that started a little bit later. It doesn't have quite so many countries in tow. It is, again, voluntary, and it's all about creating a single market for vocational education and training, and also about lifelong learning. And there are two documents which have been published in the last, I think it's less than a year. One of them is called Europe 2020, which is a European Commission document giving strategic priority for education and skills. And the second one is another document, the New Impetus for European Cooperation in Vocational Education and Training, which sets out a sort of vision for where VET should get to by the year 2020. So what you see is in Europe a lot of initiatives, but all as part of a coordinated whole and all as part fitting into overall strategies and goals and objectives. Looking in more detail at the Bologna process, it's a non-binding intergovernmental agreement, and I think that probably has quite a lot of resonance in Canada, because I think your provinces have many characteristics that are similar to our countries. And of course some of our countries manage to have those differences even within themselves. This was just said for Margaret's benefit. What has been agreed is that all university degrees of those, was it 46 countries, I think? All university degrees will be, initially they said, first cycle a bachelor degree, second cycle a master's degree, third cycle a doctoral degree, and then they brought in a short cycle as well. Now, I think, actually I've got a mistake on this slide, because I think it's 3 years for the bachelor degree rather than 4 years. So I apologize for that. And I think to get agreement in such a short time and to get implementation in such a short time across this great wide swathe of countries and universities, and as I say, these are the most prestigious universities in the world in many cases, who are changing 1,000 years of tradition. This is a tremendous achievement. It's very much focused on learning outcomes, and they define levels for what a degree should be, both in generic terms, and that's using what they call the Dublin descriptors. I told you we'd be going around all the capitals. We're not doing badly. The descriptors are definitions of what somebody at that level should be able to do. And then they are now developing, and have developed for most subject areas, subject benchmarks, which are a core set of learning outcomes, so that you know that if somebody has a degree in psychology, it doesn't matter from where within the European higher education area, it should have the following characteristics at its core. Of course it can be different in particular areas, but it will at least cover this general core set. And they have also agreed a set of credit system, ECTS, and then lastly there's something called the diploma supplement, and that'll be mentioned again in a moment, but the diploma supplement is a standard form that accompanies your degree certificate. So you've got your degree certificate, which is from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow or wherever, and is wonderfully embellished. You then have your diploma supplement, which is an absolutely standard format, and you are issued with it at the same time, so that anybody can look on it and they can find the information easily, all about the course, its learning outcomes, what you specifically did on that course, which options you took, what you wrote your thesis or your project about, everything like that. And a bit about the organisation that you got it from, the university or whatever. So that's the diploma supplement. And normally you get it in 2 languages, your mother tongue or the language that which the degree was delivered, and another one, which very often is English, but it might be German, it might be French, whatever. And of course it makes it much easier to translate, even if it's not in your own tongue. If it's in English, German, French as a second language, makes it much easier for an employer in a third country to either get it translated or to actually understand what it's saying. So it's really helpful in terms of making portability. Copenhagen process is about VET and lifelong learning, and it's dealing with all the different areas, but you will see that in there is informal learning and non-formal learning, which of course is very much what PLA is about, or PLAR. And again, it's a non-binding intergovernment agreement, and what we're finding is that we're having national approaches. We've set up national coordinating committees and everything like that, but also the sectors are beginning to say, actually, there's a sectoral dimension to this. So, for example, in the financial sector, they've been setting up a body which will look at financial VET, financial services VET, across Europe, because they say, we can't be sure that the national body actually understands the technicalities in this subject area, but we do as a sector. It may not be in our mother tongue, but we can actually look at this and understand whether it's a proper qualification or not. So we've got sectoral dimensions developing. And again, learning outcomes are enshrined in there. They are at the core of it. And so all courses everywhere, both at higher education level and at VET level, are increasingly being expressed in learning outcomes. And there are 4 bits that are all associated with Copenhagen: Europass, which I'll talk a bit more about, EQF, which I'll talk a bit more about. There's ECVET, which is the credit system for vocational education and training, and there's EQAF, which is trying to set up a standard framework for quality assurance in vocational education and training, so that different countries can collect data that will enable them to benchmark against the other 30 countries and see how their country is doing. And this is very much the way that we're proceeding in Europe, that we decide on a framework, we collect information and get feedback on how we're doing. We then pinch ideas from other countries, we emulate, we strive. We've got differences, but we're very much moving in the same direction. And I've given a website address for finding out about Copenhagen. The European Qualifications Framework, one of the things that is very important, particularly when you're moving away from degree levels, is knowing what level of intellectual challenge is actually reflected by a particular qualification. You could have a qualification that called itself a certificate in civil engineering, and you wouldn't have a clue whether that was aimed at the person who was going to dig holes in civil engineering, or whether it's the person who is going to supervise a construction site with 1,000 people working on it. So the idea of the qualifications framework, they've identified 8 different levels. You look at the learning outcomes and decide what levels those learning outcomes relate to. The intention is that it should cover all types of qualification. In other words, anything that is assessed and a little piece of paper given to you at the end. And that's more or less the definition that is used for qualification in the EQF. And it very definitely is intended, quite explicitly is intended to cover informal and non-formal learning. So again, looking very much at PLAR. And one of the other things that is there is that all the countries that have signed up to the EQF have said that they will create a national qualifications framework. In other words, they will take all the qualifications that they have in their country and they will say, these ones we reckon are at this level, these ones are at this level, and so they define a set of reference levels which don't need to be the same as the EQF level, but they will then relate their reference levels to the EQF. And we've already got the first few countries have gone through and related their national qualification frameworks to the EQF. So far, I believe it is Malta, Ireland, and UK. But of course, when we say the UK, there are 4 different ones in the UK. We have 4 different national qualification frameworks. In Scotland, I think they have 12 levels. In England, they have 8 levels, but they're different from the EQF levels, and so on. So each country can develop a national qualifications framework that fits its reality. They're committed to developing it, and they will then relate it to the EQF so that you can see how it relates to other people's. And I understand from Jens Bjornevold that about 100 or more countries worldwide either have or are working towards a national qualification framework. So I throw that as a challenge to Canada. The commitment is that by 2010, by the end of 2010, which is not very far away, all of the countries will have related their national qualification framework to the European qualification framework. I think many of the countries have found that it's much more difficult than they thought, both creating a national qualifications framework and getting all the agreement about it, and then actually relating it to the European qualifications framework. And so we're lagging behind, but it is anticipated that 27 out of 32 countries will have done that by the end of 2011. And again, the stated target is that by 2012, the following year, all new qualifications will have an EQF level attached to them. And I think that's probably easier to achieve than the preceding target. But yeah, it may not be. But there is movement. And what has really happened is the move towards the national qualifications framework in each country has been a real driver for change and reform. It has really caused people to have a look at what their qualifications mean. The fact that they're based on learning outcomes is revolutionary, and people are really changing the way their qualifications, their teaching, their assessment is happening. They've developed a set of tools to help you with all of this, and they're called Europass tools. And the first thing is a standard European Europass CV format. It's not perfect. The software that it's on is actually jolly difficult. It doesn't work terribly well, I find. But it's there. It's a standard format. And again, it's to help employers when they get a CV from somebody, rather than it being in some fancy, different format, it's a standard one. There's a language passport, which has a set of benchmarks for different degrees of fluency in language. There's a document called Europass Mobility, which is for recording short periods spent either on training or on work experience in another country. I mentioned the diploma supplement before, which was this extra document in a standard format for university degrees. As well as that, there's the certificate supplement, which is for VET courses. And the main difference between the two is that the diploma supplement records what you as an individual did as each of your different things, each of the different optional courses you studied, the name of your project, whereas the certificate supplement is standard for a particular qualification. It's a standard format for a particular qualification. And so the themes that have been coming through from Europe are voluntary reform. Nobody's sent any tanks onto anybody's lawn. And it's not just the European Union. it's European Union and others, and what's happening is that a lot of the rest of the world is saying, hey, that's quite a good idea. I think we'll try and do something like that. And actually, it would be much easier for our people if what we do is compatible with what we're doing in Europe rather than off in a different direction. And so what we are seeing, I think, is in the great big, this is a metallurgical metaphor, in the great big melt and ferment of a bubbling metal, we've got some crystals beginning to form in Europe, and it's crystallizing out all around. And for those who didn't do metallurgy, I apologize. Then diversity, transparency, these are absolutely core to the whole thing. Mobility and single markets are what are driving it. Single market for labour, single market for education, single market for higher education. Social inclusion has been very important in the European Union, very explicit, and these frameworks help with that. And doing it all by creating common frameworks. Learning outcomes are core to it. It is not possible, I'm certain, without learning outcomes. National qualifications frameworks we also think are core to it, and the explicit inclusion of PLAR in most of the documents that are coming out, except of course they call it validation. And the development of occupational standards is something that is also happening very fast, so statements of competencies related to different occupations, which can be picked up by vocational courses, picked up by professional institutions, regulating bodies, all sorts of people. However, as I said right at the beginning, all is not perfect yet in the European garden, so that we have, for instance, a project which we're a part of called UNILO, which is promoting the EQF learning outcomes approach within European universities. And of course, if everything was already hunky-dory, then we wouldn't need such a project. And the extent of ignorance that we're encountering is quite impressive. But of course, by the end of our project, with any luck, it should be diminished. And we have insisted, that's we, the UK partner, has insisted that professional institutions should be in there, because whereas most of the European countries, the professional title comes from the university degree, in UK it comes from professional institutions. So in terms of promoting the EQF learning outcomes approach, then it makes an awful lot of sense that professional institutions should be there. And it was easy for us because, in fact, most of our professional institutions have already gladly, several years ago, adopted a learning outcome approach. So it was something we could brag about in the project. Okay, brief chance for you to ask questions if there's something that isn't clear, or make a point. Sir.
Just a question. Are non-European countries eligible to sign up to the Bologna process in that?
I don't know. I would very much hope so. I would very much hope that it was possible for Canada anyway to sign up more broadly than just Bologna or Copenhagen. But I don't know the legal answer to that. I think it must be possible because I can't see how Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan would find it easier than Canada. But I may be wrong.
Can I ask a question? Why is it promoting the EQF learning outcomes approach within European universities when the university sector has the European higher education area and not all universities have adopted the EQF?
It's just what the project was. It's what the proposal went in as. It's what it is. We're not the contractor for the project. We're just a lowly English partner, UK partner.
Is there some overarching administrative body that coordinates all this?
Sort of. There's, within the European Commission, which is the civil service of the European Union, which is actually very small. Then there is the Directorate General of Education and Culture, and that is the body which has been developing all of the things that we're mentioning here. They, in addition, have got a research institute they've set up called CEDEFOP, Centre de Formation Professionnelle, I think, which is based in Thessaloniki, and which is a research organisation which holds conferences and generally tries to promote VET and EQF and everything like that. And then there's one other body called the European Training Foundation, which is aimed at those who aren't in the European Union but are nearby. And the European Union wants very much to promote prosperous countries as its neighbours, because it leads to greater peace and greater prosperity and fewer people trying to come in illegally and all the rest of it. And so one of the main ways they say of doing that is through training, and the European Training Foundation therefore concentrates on the CIS countries, the ex-Soviet Union countries, and the Mediterranean countries, and there may be some other nearby countries that we want to try and help. Okay, I'm going to rattle on in that case, if that's all right. Okay, the Apple Bud Project. It's got a website. Website, of course, is about to have all sorts of things on, but they're not all on it yet. So if you look tonight, please could you look again in a week's time. I want to talk about the project, about the case studies which we did, about the model that we used, and a little bit about the comparisons, and mostly the lessons from the pilots that we carried out. So the project, it's to develop APL for the Polish construction industry, and I believe that even here in Canada, the Polish plumber is an icon for the migrant worker. And certainly across Europe, the Polish plumber is the migrant worker. So the reason the project started was because they were short of 250,000 construction workers in Poland, and that's because at least 250,000 construction workers had migrated from Poland into other parts of Europe. And the intention was to develop mechanisms for not only unqualified Poles in Poland, but also Poles outside Poland, and also not Poles who wanted to work in Poland. And we've had not very much emphasis on the not Poles who want to work in Poland, mainly because the recession hit just at the time. And we found our work was pretty well cut out with Poles in Poland and Poles outside Poland. The project is led by the trade union for construction workers, which is called Budowlani, which just means the construction worker. And you'll notice the first three letters there. But they have been very much doing it together with the Employers Association for the construction industry. And then the third partner in Poland is the Lifelong Learning Research Institute, so a government research institute. And then in addition to that, 6 other countries are represented. Belgium, Germany, Italy, UK are because they all have interesting experience to contribute on RPL. Romania is because not only does it have interesting experience to contribute, but also because it's a very similar situation to Poland. And when we wrote the proposal, we thought that Romania was likely to be a source of workers for Poland. But what we found was that they really are in a very similar situation to Poland, and they're also desperate to find ways of getting more construction workers. And Turkey was because we wanted to find one country that was likely to move into, provide workers within the rest of Europe. And it's a 2-year project which finished a week ago. and so I'm on borrowed time now, and it's under the European Community Lifelong Learning Programme. It's a transfer of innovation project. And for those of you who don't know the colours of your flags around Europe, Poland, you can see all the Polish partners on the right-hand side. And Belgium, Germany, Italy, Romania, Turkey, and you can guess that one. So quite a big partnership, and outcomes of the project: a set of case studies of best practice. We also mapped foreign qualifications against Polish qualifications in the areas of bricklayer, roofer, and plumber, just in order to see what the equivalent qualifications were and how they compared. And we've also prepared a document on barriers to mutual recognition based on the experience of doing that, and also on the experience of the pilots. And we then developed an assessment model for PLA in Poland, and we developed a set of competencies for the assessors in Poland and a training program for them. And then we carried out pilots not only in Poland, but in Belgium, Italy, Romania, and UK. It was decided that for the foreign pilots, the pilots outside Poland, then we would use existing systems rather than trying to set up a brand new system in those countries, which is going to be a lot of work and perhaps not very much value. We decided we would use the existing system and use it to give people not only a qualification in that foreign country, but also to then see if it could be recognized back in Poland. And the reason that Germany doesn't appear there is because it proved too difficult to find candidates, because Germany, the transition arrangements, which means that Poles aren't allowed to work in Germany, that finishes at the end of this year. So that any Poles who are working in the construction industry in Germany at the moment have to do so with dark glasses and with their hoods on. And so it was too difficult for our German partner to find candidates. And I think that they are more formal there, and that if something is seen to be illegal, they're less likely to have anything to do with it than perhaps we might in England. We then also have started making plans for a Polish body for RPL. So, looking at the case studies, which was the first thing we did to try and find out what best practice was, and I mentioned that in an earlier session today, so if you've heard it all before, I do apologize. We've put together case studies in a common format for Belgium, Canada, Czech Republic, Germany, France, Italy, Romania, and UK. And that is actually a very interesting set of documents. And in addition, there is a common analysis at the beginning, comparing and contrasting. And those case studies looked at a whole variety of different things from the different countries, and then there's a list of the different aspects that we had in the case studies, and they will be available, with any luck, on the website by the end of this week. As always, we had a lot of problems with words to use and trying to make sure we understood what each other were using. So by referential, what we meant was the Polish qualification which we would refer to and we would refer our foreign qualifications to. And so I mentioned the three occupations. Of course, we found that plumber was very wide. It covered water plumbers, gas plumbers and heating and ventilating, so air conditioning plumbers as well. And the project, our Applebud project, happened to coincide with a national project to reform all the curricula in vet schools in Poland. And in fact, because we'd chosen the right partners in Poland, therefore they were all sitting on the bodies of this reform project. And so it was brilliant timing. We were able to have a great influence on the reform of the vet. The vet project chose our 3 occupations as amongst their pilots. We got the documents of the new qualifications, which we were then able to use for our pilots, which of course piloted them also as qualifications for the new vet reform. So it was absolutely perfect, and we had great excitement coming from not only the Ministry of Infrastructure, but also the Ministry of Education and also the Ministry of Labour. All of them very, very interested, sometimes too interested. They were actually vying with each other to be the lead ministry in this. Poland does have occupational standards, but they've not actually managed to integrate them, give them legal framework or institutional support yet. So we decided we wouldn't use occupational standards, which would have been much better. We would instead use the learning outcomes from the reformed school curricula. And the new curricula are modular, which is great. They are based on learning outcomes, which is great. And the modules can be separately assessed. This is new, revolutionary. They haven't done that before. So within, for example, bricklaying, there's one module which is about laying bricks and blocks, and there's one module which is about plastering. And we then, as I've mentioned earlier, we mapped the qualifications against the equivalent qualifications in partner countries. So there is the layout of the bricklayer qualification in the new, and you can see there are the 2 basic modules, and it is possible to be assessed in one or both and get a qualification in one or both. And this makes a huge difference when you are dealing with PLAR, because it means that somebody may have more limited experience or may not be. You're much more likely to get a successful outcome from it if you've got a more modular basis. And the model that we used is there on the left side. So it was self-assessment and with some support and guidance, and then 3 tests: health and safety test, a theoretical knowledge test, and a practical test. Theoretical knowledge test was multiple choice, and the health and safety test was a multiple choice, and the practical test was really doing it. And as a result of those things, then one got a qualification at the end. In the pilots, we had 16 candidates. I can't remember exactly how it went, but there were 5 or more in each of the 3 occupations. And we found a training centre in Gdansk, and we had support from all these different national bodies. And this again made a huge difference. ZTOM Cert is probably the most widely known awarding body in Poland. So to have your certificate from there actually means something. Because we had the ministries and the National Labour Inspectorate, they provided the health and safety test. The Polish Federation of Engineering Associations, they provided credibility and links with employers. And the education superintendent, again, tied it into the national system and the local national system. And so, as a result, huge amount of credibility, and people at the end got qualifications. Although this was a pilot, they got qualifications that were nationally recognised. which we hadn't expected to be possible when we started the project. When we talked about it, everybody was certain we'd never manage to get that, especially in just 2 years. So very exciting. The assessment took 2 days. They, on the first day, had a briefing and were talked through things and had the health and safety and the theory test. If they passed those 2 tests, they were allowed to go on to the practical test. And what we didn't test, what we weren't able to do in the pilots, was migrant workers working in Poland. But we did test migrant workers working outside Poland in other countries. If people got both modules of the qualification, then they got an official qualification with the Polish Eagle. And that's as good as you can get with the Polish Eagle. If they only got one of the 2, then they didn't get the Polish Eagle, but they got ZTOM cert. And that's the next best thing. In fact, for plumbers, you had the 3 modules rather than just 2. So the major awarding body is ZTOM cert. People didn't have a clue what APL was about before we started the project. Now there's very wide understanding, and understanding within the ministries and within the bodies that do policy and strategy and so on. So it's been desperately important from that point of view. Also, it's been agreed now in principle, and they're busy trying to make it happen in practice, that the labour offices, the employment offices in all of the regions and all of the towns can pay for assessment and put it under the budget for training. Before, they only had a budget for training, and assessment is not training. And so people couldn't actually get APL paid for. But now it's been agreed that this makes an awful lot of sense. So this is a major step forward as well. There's been a lot of interest from other sectors, and of course the construction sector therefore is strutting because they're the first. They brought it to Poland and they're very pleased with themselves, as they should be. And we've still got a lot of work to do on the information, advice and guidance, because, start off with, there isn't a great tradition of that in Poland. There aren't many such bodies around, and certainly we didn't have very much success at finding people who were good at helping with that, so it tended not to happen. And the authority that the different awarding bodies and so on have doesn't stretch beyond the borders, so we're not able to give this qualification straight away outside Poland. But what we're hoping is that by demonstrating that they are equivalent and they do meet the requirements, then we're hoping that we'll be able to change that in the future and retrospectively recognise what was done outside Poland. The foreign pilots used existing APL systems in each of the countries. They particularly explored issues for migrant workers using those APL systems. The little crossed tools system meant that it was a short, practical, simulated test. Down right at the bottom you'll see OSAT, which was a portfolio creation. And those of you who know about the UK National Vocational Qualification System will know that the typical method of assessing for a national vocational qualification is developing a portfolio. Therefore, when assessing construction workers, actually in UK we have 2 systems. One of them is we've developed a short one-day test where you get asked to do a bit of building and you're given a drawing and etc. And the other is a traditional, over the last 10 years traditional portfolio development, but many of them have been able to accelerate that process so that instead of lasting the typical 10 months a year, they can do it in the course of 6 weeks or 2 months with either reduced numbers of visits to the person on site or with very frequent visits to the person on site. But it does mean having the opportunity to demonstrate a big range of different sorts of work in order to demonstrate that one's fulfilled all the competencies. So my feeling is that that on-site portfolio creation is not actually helpful for PLAR of people who are already competent from a different country without a credential. It's much better to give them, if you can develop it, a short, sharp, simulated to demonstrate their competence. I think it's more practical. It works better in the time available. Here's some pictures of happy builders demonstrating their prowess. Out of the 3 that we tested in, we had 4 bricklayers in UK who we were going to test, and we had a lot of trouble finding them. And out of those 4, 2 actually did not pass, which took them and us by surprise, because the Polish construction worker has a very high reputation. 1 broke his arm beforehand, and the man in the middle, he was successful. But what was quite gratifying was that the one-day test was clearly a good discriminating test. It wasn't a walkover, it wasn't a pushover. So what did we find from the foreign pilots? First of all, looking at the recruitment of people onto the pilot, migrants are jolly difficult to contact, and you probably know that better in Canada than we do in UK. The APL systems are not well known, and they're not well known, never mind with the migrants, they're not well known in the UK vocation education and training system either. The big motivator for the candidates was getting the foreign qualification, because it made it easier to work in the legal market rather than the illegal market. One of the big problems is that the benefit, therefore, is for the candidates, for the individual tradesmen, but the systems for funding and assessing and everything like that are all set up for the employers. And the employers, even if they do benefit, in general don't see that they benefit, and so don't have the same motivation to help people through. Now, we found that some enlightened employers do see the benefit and do help people through, but in general, employers aren't terribly interested. No APL support and guidance except from sympathetic assessors, and I don't think I should underplay how much help sympathetic assessors gave, but it's definitely beyond their job description, and more than that, it could be said to compromise their independence. So it's a significant issue. Virtually no help aimed at migrant workers, and where there is help, it's on a project basis. And we found that the systems that were there, because they were project basis, they changed every year, and nobody knew what the system was. Just for example, our 4 Polish bricklayers, they had to fill in a form for us to start off with for the project. Then they had to fill in a form for the assessment agency. Then they had to fill in a form for the awarding body. And then the assessment agency found that the funding source had changed from what they thought it was, and so they had to fill in a 4th form. And they were all the same information. And it's no wonder that migrant workers don't manage to get qualifications. Language was definitely a barrier. Even where the candidates were not too bad in English, they were very good in construction English, but I suspect even in their own language, on vocabulary and talking about assessment, they hadn't gone into construction because they were good at taking exams or interested in classroom stuff. It wasn't their part of ship. So language was a barrier, but it was overcome and could be overcome. And there's a long tradition in Poland and also in construction where you don't like officials. Even when you are obeying all the rules, you just don't like officials around. You don't like people who are coming from outside and looking at you and asking you to sign forms. And that was significant too, especially on the recruitment side. And I think this is my final slide. The small scale of assessment is more expensive. The theory test, so this is conclusions about the assessment part. The theory test is not liked, and it's much better if it can be done orally rather than written. If you have a written theory test, even the English candidates find that the way that the questions are asked, they don't know what they mean. They're written by academics in general, and they just don't know what they mean. And so you need to do this theory testing orally rather than written, even if it's not in their own tongue. There were few problems with the practical test. No support and guidance again, and the language was a barrier again in the assessment. All of the assessment processes we found were rigorous and fair, and the candidates found them to be rigorous and fair. People ended up very impressed by the system, and they were proud of the qualifications they'd got because it was a good system. So that was good. The candidates were very positive about APL at the end, and we wish we could have awarded the Polish qualification.